Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Books of Magic by Neil Gaiman. Now, The Books of Magic is a graphic novel which was originally published as a four-part comic book series which was published between the years 1990 and 1991, but later those four parts were all published into one graphic novel. Now, this also spawned an ongoing comic book series of the same name. However, I don't believe Neil Gaiman had anything to do with the ongoing series which came after this. Now, when this was published as a four-part comic book series, it was published by DC Comics, but when it was published as a graphic novel, it was published by Vertigo, which I know is technically part of DC. Now, Neil Gaiman is of course the author of books like American Gods and Coraline and Stardust, and I know he's written a lot of other comics besides this one. Like, he wrote the comic book series Sandman, and I believe he also wrote a few Batman comics as well. Now, the plot of the Books of Magic is, it's about this 12-year-old boy from England named Timothy Hunter, who, as it turns out, is destined to become the world's greatest magician, but he, of course, doesn't know this yet, and these four magicians come to him to basically set him on the right path, because it turns out that he does have the potential to become an evil magician. So, these four magicians have to show him, the good path, like, show him the right way, but they also give him a choice of whether he chooses to, accept magic as his destiny, or if he chooses to live a normal life, and they explain to him that there is a powerful price to pay for choosing the path of magic, and, the story is essentially broken up into four parts. In the first part of the story, this character called the Phantom Stranger takes Timothy back in time and shows him literally the beginning of time. Like, he takes him to back when there was nothing, back before God created the universe, and Timothy witnesses the Big Bang, and he witnesses Lucifer's fall from heaven, and the Phantom Stranger explains to him how, apparently on planet Earth, before the dinosaurs came to be, apparently Earth was inhabited by demons until life started to evolve on this planet, and, essentially he explains to him how, throughout history, people who had the ability to practice magic were always hated and feared by mortal men, and he talks to him about, like, the witch trials and things like that, and it's actually really interesting because you get to see the history of the universe that this book takes place in. And then in the second section of the book, the character of John Constantine takes Timothy through present-day America and shows him a lot of, magicians and wizards and stuff in America today, and then the character of Dr. Occult in the third section takes Timothy into other dimensions, and then in the final section, a character called Mr. E takes Timothy into the future, showing him his possible future, but also showing him the possible future of magic and the possible future of the human race. And that's the basic plot line of the Books of Magic. Now, these four magicians who come to Timothy, the Phantom Stranger, John Constantine, Mr. E, and Dr. Occult, these were all characters from other DC comics that came before this. Now, out of those four characters, the only one who I was actually familiar with before I read this book was the character of John Constantine. Now, the character of John Constantine, I believe, was originally created by Alan Moore, and he originated as a character from the Swamp Thing comics, which I know Alan Moore wrote a lot of those, but he later on got his own comic book series called Hellblazer, and the Hellblazer comics were made into the movie Constantine in 2005. Now, I personally love the movie Constantine. Yes, I know that movie is like a billion times different from the comic books, but as a standalone movie, I actually think that movie is a really fun action horror film. But, recently there's been the TV show Constantine, which I haven't watched yet, but apparently that's a more true adaptation of the comic books than the 2005 version was. Now, I really enjoyed the Books of Magic. I thought it was a really fun comic. I did have some minor problems with it, but I'll get to those in a second. Overall, I really enjoyed this story. I thought it was a really fun fantasy story, and it really did have a lot of imagination to it. Now, the book does kind of end leaving it open for continuations, and I guess the ongoing comic book series that came after this, I guess those were the continuations of this, but even though it does leave it open for sequels, it also is a very self-contained story. Like, it could have easily have just ended like there, like one of those open-ended kind of stories, but it's a very self-contained story, even though it does share a lot of links with a lot of other comics. Like, of course, this shares a lot of links with the Constantine comics, and this also shares some connections to Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, because the character of Death from the Sandman series does make an appearance in this book. But, even though it does share a lot of links with other comics, it's still very much a self-contained story and can easily be read as such. I really enjoyed the book, and one thing I really liked about it was it definitely seemed to borrow a lot from mythology and religion and even history, and it also seemed to borrow from other works of literature as well. Actually, in the part of the book where the character of Mr. E is taking Tim into the future, it actually reminded me a lot of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, because when Mr. E is showing Tim the possible future of mankind, it reminded me a lot of, what the main character of The Time Machine eventually finds out becomes of the human race in that book, so it reminded me a little bit of that. But, overall, I really enjoyed this graphic novel. Now, one thing that's kind of cool about it is each chapter in this book, because keep in mind, this book was originally published as a 4-part comic book series. Each one is done by a different artist, so you get a slightly different artwork style in each of the chapters in this book. Now, I did have some minor problems with the story. One problem I had is I felt like the main character could have been a little more developed, I think, because they keep talking about how he has the potential to become an evil wizard, but there was really nothing about the character that really struck me as the kind of person who could eventually become evil. I feel like they could have added some kind of dark side to the character, which could indicate that he could possibly become evil, but you really didn't get that from the character in this book. And also, in the book, you do get kind of the implication that he doesn't have the best relationship with his father, but they don't really touch on that too much, but I wish they kind of did, because that might add more to the whole idea that he could potentially become an evil wizard instead of the good wizard that Constantine and the other magicians are trying to get him to be. I still liked the character, I just thought thought he was a little underdeveloped in that regard. Another thing that I thought was kind of weird is, now in the story when he first meets these four magicians and they introduce him to magic, he of course starts kind of freaking out, which is realistic. Like, realistically, if somebody started showing real magic to me, I probably would freak out too, and he's very unwilling at first to accept the idea of magic, which is realistic, but the problem with this is, though, this book is also set in the DC universe, and there's a part in the book where Constantine mentions Gotham City, and there's also a part in this book where the character of Mystery mentions that he has met Superman before, so you realize that, like, superheroes exist in this universe, like Superman, and not for nothing, but if a being like Superman existed in my world, I would be willing to buy almost anything, even something like magic. So, yes, it would be more it's more realistic that he's not willing to accept the idea of magic, but since this is a world where characters like Superman exist, you know, it seems like something like magic wouldn't be too out there, I think. I mean, then again, Superman's not really magic, he's more of an alien, so maybe it's understandable why the character of Tim is not that willing to accept the idea of magic, but at the same time, though, you know, since this is set in, you know, the DC universe where you have superheroes and stuff, it just seems to me a little odd that he's completely, at first, unwilling to accept this. But once again, I recommend Books of Magic. It's a really fun graphic novel, and, you know, if you're a comic book fan and if you're a fantasy fan, I would definitely recommend this.